When people think about the 12 apostles, they often imagine 12 men who looked and lived almost the same way. In reality, they came from very different backgrounds, professions, and personalities. Some details about their lives are well documented, while others remain uncertain even today. The New Testament records the names of all 12 apostles, but it does not tell us everything about each of them. Historians, biblical scholars, and Christian traditions together help us build a broader picture, although not every tradition can be confirmed with historical evidence. In this video, we will explore 12 surprising facts about Jesus' apostles. Some come directly from the Bible, some are supported by historical research, and others are long-standing Christian traditions. We will clearly distinguish between these sources throughout the video. Many people believe that all of Jesus' apostles were fishermen. This idea is understandable because Peter, Andrew, James, and John were all fishermen on the Sea of Galilee before following Jesus. However, the group was much more diverse. Matthew worked as a tax collector before becoming an apostle, while Simon was known as Simon the Zealot. Their different occupations meant they brought very different life experiences into the group. Jesus did not choose people from only one profession or one social class. The 12 apostles represented different backgrounds, making the group far more diverse than many people imagine. Among the 12 apostles, at least 2 pairs were brothers. Peter and Andrew were brothers, while James and John were also brothers. This is clearly recorded in the Gospels. Peter and Andrew earned their living by fishing on the Sea of Galilee before Jesus called them. James and John worked in the same trade with their father, Zebedee, who owned fishing boats and hired workers. The presence of brothers among the apostles reminds us that Jesus often called people from existing family and community networks rather than gathering complete strangers from different places. Before becoming one of Jesus' apostles, Matthew worked as a tax collector. According to the Gospels, Jesus called him while he was sitting at his tax booth. Tax collectors were responsible for collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman government or its local authorities. Because of this role, many Jewish people viewed them with suspicion and distrust. Matthew's background was very different from that of the fishermen. His inclusion among the apostles shows that Jesus chose followers from very different walks of life rather than from a single social group. One of the apostles is introduced as Simon the Zealot. The title Zealot appears in the Gospel lists, but its exact meaning is still discussed by biblical scholars. Some historians believe the title may indicate that Simon had once been associated with the Zealot movement, a group known for strongly opposing Roman rule. However, the New Testament does not provide further details about his earlier life. Because the available evidence is limited, historians cannot say with certainty how closely Simon was connected to that movement. This remains one of the many unanswered questions about the apostles. Thomas is often remembered as Doubting Thomas. This nickname comes from one event recorded after Jesus' resurrection, when Thomas said he would not believe until he saw and touched Jesus' wounds. After meeting the risen Jesus, Thomas openly declared his faith. The Gospel of John records his words, "My Lord and my God," making this one of the clearest statements of faith found in the New Testament. Because of that single episode, Thomas became closely associated with doubt. Yet the Bible records him as one of the 12 apostles who continued following Jesus alongside the others. The Bible never states John's exact age. However, many early Christian traditions describe him as the youngest among the 12 apostles. Some historians suggest that John's long lifespan may have allowed him to outlive the other apostles. According to early Christian tradition, he spent his later years in Ephesus and died at an advanced age. Because these details come mainly from Christian tradition rather than the New Testament itself, historians cannot confirm every part of this account with certainty. Before betraying Jesus, Judas Iscariot was one of the 12 apostles and was trusted with managing the group's money. The Gospel of John identifies him as the keeper of the money bag. This responsibility suggests that Judas held an important practical role within the group. He was not treated as an outsider before the events leading to Jesus' arrest. The story of Judas reminds us that every member of the 12 apostles shared daily life with Jesus, even though their later choices would lead them down very different paths. The everyday language spoken by Jesus and most of the apostles was Aramaic. It was the common language used by ordinary people throughout much of Judea and Galilee during the first century. Hebrew continued to be used in religious settings, especially when reading the scriptures in synagogues. Meanwhile, Greek was widely spoken across the Eastern Roman Empire and was useful for trade and communication between different regions. This multilingual environment helped explain how the message about Jesus later spread beyond Judea and to many different parts of the Roman world. None of the 12 apostles are described in the Bible as famous political leaders, wealthy nobles, or highly trained religious scholars before they followed Jesus. Most lived ordinary lives within their local communities. Their backgrounds included fishermen, a tax collector, and people whose occupations were never recorded. This diversity reflected everyday society in first-century Judea and Galilee. The apostles' ordinary backgrounds make their later influence even more remarkable. Within a few decades, their message had reached many cities across the Roman Empire. Peter, John, and Matthew appear frequently throughout the New Testament. In contrast, apostles such as James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot are mentioned only a few times. Because so little information survives about several apostles, many details commonly repeated today come from later Christian traditions rather than from the biblical text itself. According to early Christian tradition, many apostles traveled far beyond Judea after Jesus' resurrection. Different traditions place them in regions such as Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and even India. Some of these journeys are supported by early historical sources, while others rely mainly on church tradition. Historians continue to study the available evidence, and not every account can be verified with certainty. Even after 2,000 years, historians cannot answer every question about the apostles. For several of them, only a handful of reliable historical details have survived. The story of the 12 apostles is built from 3 different kinds of sources: the New Testament, early Christian tradition, and historical research. Together, they help us understand the people who played a central role in the earliest years of Christianity, while also reminding us that some parts of their lives remain a mystery.